It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Mojave Spaceman. You know how there's always people out there who tell you wild tales. Well, this guy claims that this happened. Some other guy says that happened to him. I never did buy it. Too many people out there in the sun, drinking beer in the dry heat. Might as well say the Lord Almighty himself came down from heaven and made them the new chosen one. Well, there was one such guy, Darrell Jameson, an old man who lived off of Interstate 15 just outside of Baker. Back in '94, he came into town one day, coming back from Mojave. He claimed to have seen something rather strange. I don't know if I believe him, but, well, I don't know. Now, he came back from a week of camping out in the desert. He always was the adventurous type, been that way since he was a kid, and stayed that way till he died. This time he was out for his annual camping trip. Now, being a bachelor all his life, he always had time to go and camp, hunt, fish, and such. Well, he was a man of simple pursuits. Darrell was a handyman, taking odd jobs, doing whatever he was hired to do. Hell, he even served as a guide for anyone wanting to go sightseeing in the desert. Well, he came into Jimbo's that day. My friend John and I were at a booth near the pool tables. At first, he stands in front of us, I assume adjusting his eyes to the change of light. Then he turns around and recognizes us. John moves to offer him a seat. I took off his flannel shirt and sat down. Looked around the room before looking at the half-full mug in front of him. How'd it go? I asked. I looked at him. His eyes were distant. He wasn't in the room. He was still out in the desert. Whatever was on his mind, it weighed heavily on him. Darrell, I said loudly at him. He returned to the bar. What happened out there? He reached into his pocket, pulled out his pack of cigarettes and lit one. He tapped his fingers on the table, called the waitress for a cup and a fresh pitcher of beer. Keep us in the dark, why don't you? I told him. Well, the fact is, he sighed, I don't believe it myself. I poured each of us a glass of beer. He scanned the room, then poured himself another glass and drank it with as much vigor as the last one. So, he started. I'm up there for the third week, and yeah, you know, all of my years of going out there, seeing the land, feeling the air, tasting the water, I come to realize I was there. What? Asked John. I did, well, my Mecca, if you will, replied Darrell. He must have found what he was looking for out there, because something else was on his mind. What's it like? I asked. Well, kind of like those new pictures Hubble started taking, without description. John poured himself another glass. The pool tables that made their cracking sounds, the classic rock soundtrack that played in the background, they had the conversations of patrons. All that noise went silent. All I heard then was what Darrell had to say. I camped out by Macedonia Canyon, just off of Kelso Sema Road. This time of year, the mule deer would be grazing around, plus it's one of the few places left where I haven't been. Seemed long overdue, and hunting deer is always a plus. I had to keep myself out of sight, since I wasn't supposed to be there with all the other campsites nearby. I wanted to be alone, just me and the Mojave. Over the 3 weeks I was there, I spent time hunting the mule deer that were grazing. I also took the ranger up to the river to fish. Took me the whole day. Wouldn't get back till an hour after sundown. By the time sundown came, every which way was dark, but damn, how beautiful the night sky covers the ground with light. I brought a small propane bottle and a portable stove as well as a lantern. Campfires would bring the attention of park officials. Well, last week, when I got to camp to cook dinner, I sat in front of the tent with the stove on, skillet getting hot. Went to the east, towards the direction of Black Canyon. light shine in the sky. The light was concentrated and very bright. It stayed on for what I'd say was about 4 hours non-stop. At first I thought it must have come from some other campers. Since they were at the official campsite, me being new to this area, it felt like one big-ass nightlight. Well, after it was finally gone, I cleaned up and turned in. The surrounding silence was so peaceful. The next day, as I tracked a small herd of mule deer, they led me to Black Canyon. I passed the campgrounds and headed into the canyon. As I walked, I noticed black sand on the ground. I crouched down to pick some up, and it had a rather strong, burnt smell. I went to the nearest campground and asked about the light. Many said that light was bluish in color, and they felt a heat coming from that direction. And when the light disappeared, they heard a boom sound last night as well, but figured it to be, well, a rifle or something. The people who were close to the light said they could hear what sounded like a hum from the light. Even after the light had gone, the humming was still there, and when they heard the boom, the hum had stopped. I walked to Black Canyon, following a trail of deer. Small drops of blood appeared on the ground, and the drops got bigger as I kept walking. Just over a small hill, there was a bush that was soaked in red. As I approached, this stench filled the air. Flies were swarming around the bush. I walked around it and saw a mule deer. It was cut open and split down the belly. All its insides were taken out. I turned around to see a pack of coyotes behind me. I readied my rifle just in case, but they stood there, whimpering. I'll give it to animals to sense danger way before us. There was a shallow crater, just about 10 feet from where the deer's body lay. Walking to it, I felt a heat rising from the ground. Now, looking around, most of the surrounding plant life was burnt down to nothing but branches and twigs. I kept going, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground. I saw these impressions on the ground. They looked like boot prints, but they were massive. After 3 hours or so of being there, I nabbed myself a deer, carried it to the ranger. Went to the campgrounds where I'd parked, and people who I spoke to earlier approached me. They showed me Polaroids of the light beam. It was a solid, bright white light. Well, some pictures tried to capture the source, but all it got were the clouds. Got back to my camp and began to skin the deer. Several coyotes who followed me sat around hoping to get whatever they could. I forgot what I needed, tossed the rest to them. By sundown, the coyotes nestled near my tent. I start cooking a small portion of deer for dinner. For a second, an intense flash lights up the sky. I heard a very loud pop, and the light once again appeared. However, this time it's brighter, and it seems closer. And the coyotes start whimpering, and many started running away. I picked up my rifle, loaded a few rounds, grabbed a flashlight, and walked in the direction of the light. I could hear some of the coyotes barking at me. Got to the road, then I stopped. I don't know if it was fear, caution, or what, but I couldn't walk any further. I looked back at my camp and then back to the canyon. Whatever was out there, it wasn't bothering me. Walked back to my camp, sat with my rifle on my lap just in case, though. Early morning, I walked to the canyon. The coyotes who were with me last night stayed put. As I walked through the campground, I couldn't believe what I saw. The ground was covered in black soot and ash. There were still small bushes on fire. Tents looked as if they'd been ripped open. Things like sleeping bags and lamps were scattered everywhere. Small spots of dried blood were near many of the tents. As I went to go through the tents, well, there wasn't anyone around. Out of 20 tents, some big enough to hold 5, there was not a soul. I walked through the bushes, around Joshua trees. I even walked to the crater from the other day, but nothing. I thought of the Roanoke colony as I walked around the grounds, seeing the aftermath of whatever occurred. When I got back to camp, the coyotes were gone. I decided to take the ranger and drive down an unnamed road. As I drove down some 10 miles, I spotted a payphone. I called the park office. At first, they thought I was drunk. And after a while, they agreed to send a park ranger down there as soon as someone was available. Well, that wouldn't be till the next day. Well, the night before that, there was no light, a detail I left out of the phone call. I kept at a distance to see what the park ranger would do. He surveyed the campground, talked to someone through a radio, and went back to wait in his Jeep. 2 hours later, several vehicles came to the campground. I went back to my camp and packed my things before they noticed I was there. As I was leaving, I turned on the radio and all I heard was static while turning the knob. I drove for 10 minutes in silence, and the static comes through the speakers. I looked at the radio, but it was off. I pulled over and turned off the Ranger. No noise was coming from anywhere. Everywhere was quiet. I got out, feeling a slight breeze on my face, and all of a sudden the static comes back, louder this time. Now, through the static I could hear something else. It sounded like someone speaking, but for the life of me I couldn't make out what they were saying. I turned the volume knob down, but it was already down, making the radio off. I moved to the other knob, and whatever was talking on the other side seemed to change the way it talked. And then static took over again. I was standing there, in front of my door, unable to move. I thought, what the hell was that? God, somebody called Peter Ruckman. Even he ain't gonna believe this shit. I slowly got back into the Ranger, turned it on, and kept driving. I needed to get away from here. Well, I headed over to the Mild Hills campground. About 20 minutes of driving led me to think, what on earth was on the radio, and what had happened to the campers? When I reached the Mild Hills campgrounds, and I'm stopped by a park ranger. I sat in my truck for a while before he finally got out of his Jeep. He walked beside my door and signaled me to get out. "Howdy," he said. "Coming from Black Canyon?" "Yeah," I replied. "Camped around there?" he asked. He seemed to have a relaxed look on him, but his voice was rather serious. "I did. You called the office yesterday?" "Yeah, I did. Something wrong?" "Well, were you camped at the designated campgrounds?" "Yeah. Can I help you with something?" "You playing stupid?" Well, his tone turned on a dime. "No," I replied. "I called to report people I met there gone missing." "How do you know they were missing?" "I met several of them a few days ago." I could feel him staring through his dark sunglasses. He didn't care what I said. He'd made up his mind. "Those people," he said. "It was a company retreat. Office types. Couldn't hack it out here. You understand. They left abruptly because they weren't fit to be out here." What about the I tried to ask. "They left in a hurry," he immediately replied. "They left. They're gone. Nobody's missing. They went home, and I suggest you do the same." "But the campgrounds were wrecked. Blood and torn tents everywhere." "They left." "Did you find a mule deer that got the hell beat out of it?" "They're safe at home." "Look, you got animals scared as shit, and you tell me nothing that could explain any of it." "Enough," he shouted. "Enough. You get in your truck, you go home, you never come around here again. If I find you here again, I'll arrest you for trespassing. Got it? Now get in your truck and leave." Well, I obliged. As soon as I was driving, I looked back into the rearview mirror. We stood there the entire time, till I turned on another road. Driving down Mojave Road, I spotted another parked Jeep. This time, this one follows me. All the designated campgrounds were behind me now. Once I was out of sight of any lawmen, I turned onto a dirt road and took the long way back to Black Canyon. Waited till dark and drove slowly up to the site. There were small posts with a yellow crime scene ribbon wrapping around the camp. At 10 o'clock with a lantern, I headed out to see for myself what was up. If I got there and Mulder and Scully were there, then something was definitely going on. As I walked through the camp, there was almost nothing there. Even some of the trees had been uprooted. Some bushes were also removed, and the dirt on the ground looked fresh. I must have taken samples or evidence. I walked along the same path that brought me to the crater. It was still there. Still perfect, untouched. After a while I noticed something. Silence. There were no animals, no coyotes howling, no owls calling, or bugs buzzing. No plants, no animals, no people, no sign of life. I sat on a large boulder with the lantern off. The light from the moon and the stars covered the camp. It was dim and quiet, but peaceful. Looking towards the east, the plains looked totally black, with the outlines of the mountains dividing the land and the sky. To the west, the plains stretched beyond the earth's curve, an ocean of black sky with islands made of stars, the only thing around. I heard footsteps and got up and hid behind the boulder. It was a park ranger, a woman, with a flashlight up to her head. She was scanning the area. She walked up to the crater and kneeled down, maybe for a better look. She was short, looked to be in her late 20s, early 30s, but it was too dark to make out her face. She did have big shoulders and a small head. She kneeled down, her back turned towards me. Well, I lightly ran out of there. I stepped towards some bushes. I stepped on something that let out a loud crack. "Who's out there?" she hollered. "I'm a park ranger for the Mojave National Preserve, and have the authority by the state of California to act as law enforcement. Now, show yourself." "Okay," I replied, stepping into her light. "No need for trouble." "What are you doing out here? This place is sealed off to the public." "Oh, you don't need to tell me. I know all about it." "What are you talking about?" "Well, I called the office, told them about this place, and they tell me to leave the park and never come back." What are you talking about?" She seemed nervous. "If we calm down," I tried to put her at ease, "I'll explain myself." We stood there in the dark, and I told her what I knew. I don't think it helped much. It seemed to rattle her even more. I took her back to my truck, got the last 2 cans of beer I had. We sat on the flatbed door, facing the Providence Mountains. After some time, she seemed to calm down. Well, she didn't want any beer, settled for warm bottled water. "Why are you out here?" I finally asked. She took some time to answer. At first, I thought she didn't hear me. "I was told to patrol along Black Canyon Road," she answered. "They did say someone was lurking around, and if I ran into them, arrest them. If they resist, even in the slightest, shoot them dead." Her voice was soft and fragile. "They didn't tell me anything," she continued. "I guess they meant you, but they didn't say why you'd be out here." "They didn't say anything about what I told them?" I asked. She shook her head. "Those sons of bitches sending a green deputy out into the wild. No clue what to expect. I don't mean to sound harsh, but I've been in the desert most of my adult life. I've never seen anything like it. Not the light, not what remains." The radio in her patrol car went off, and she had to get going. As I saw her drive off, the moon hung over the mountains. Sitting in the Ranger, I turned on the radio. Nothing but static. The night covered everything. As far as I could see, it was all black everywhere. I tried to look at the direction of the canyon, of the camp, of the crater, but I couldn't be sure where it was exactly. I turned on the Ranger and just drove away from there. As I turned onto the next road, it got bumpy. The dry heat and silence didn't seem so bad. It was nice outside. Why? Why was I being forced to leave? I've always thought of this place as my home away from home. I wanted to stay here. This place was so tranquil. Everything I needed was here. Well, it was selfish to want this place to myself, but it just seemed like the ideal place to be. I drove for 10 minutes, when in the distance behind me there was a light. Well, I slammed on the brakes and turned my head. It was the same light from my first night, and the night the campers went missing. It was as intense as those nights were. So I got out of the Ranger. I just had to see it for myself. The light was bright and bluish. I couldn't get my eyes away from it. I looked up to see if there was a source, but there were clouds in the way. But these clouds weren't still. They seemed to move around the light as if what was making them were using them to cover up whatever was there. The radio switched on again, at first static, but it sounded really violent. I quickly turned to the truck, but the sound came from the speakers just like last time. I got in, turned on the truck, and tried turning the knobs in hopes of getting rid of it, but nothing. Something must have been said, but for the life of me, I couldn't make anything out. After some time, I turned off the truck, but the noise never stopped. I got out again and saw lights coming from far away. They were coming towards me very fast. I must have been some Rangers. I ran past the truck so they couldn't see, just in case. They ran past me, and as soon as they were out of sight, the light from the canyon stopped immediately. It was dark, totally dark. I got into my car and started driving as fast as I could. The only sound I could hear was the Ranger's engine. It was dark. Put my high beams on, but from the left side, dust was coming over my windshield, and the dust was becoming thick. I couldn't see past the end of the hood. I had to pull over, but as I did, I noticed something about the dust. I tried to wipe the dust off, but as the wipers went up, the dust followed right behind it, making it impossible to come off. In the rearview mirror, I could see the light start to dim. And as the dust settled and the light grew stronger, I slammed my foot onto the gas, but, well, nothing. I looked at the tachometer. The needle went well into dangerous territory, and the Ranger's exhaust caused serious smog. I gave everything I had, dead set on getting away. I looked at the side. A Joshua tree seemed to pass me, like I was moving backwards, and the light was getting closer. Slowly, very slowly. I couldn't believe it. I mean, what the literal fuck was going on? Then something came over me. I got out of the Ranger and ran as hard as I could. I was surprised that I could run. My truck went further towards the light, and I ran to the opposite direction. Soon the dust came up again. Now I was fighting to breathe as much as I was running to get away. I heard some high-pitched harmonies and saw some faint lights in front of me. I thought I was trapped, caught between the ascension of hell and its gatekeeper making sure I reunited with the campers. It was a cruiser, the female trooper. She slammed on the brakes, and I got in the passenger side before eating another pound of dust. Well, rather than try to drive away from the pull, she guns the cruiser towards it, and the winds grow more violent. The Ranger must have been doing 40 backwards. "Hey, you know what you're doing here," I hollered. She seemed frightened, but was determined to go towards the light no matter what. And then it stopped. The wind, the dust, had died suddenly. The light started to fade out before it got dark completely. She pulled over and took some heavy breaths. I saw the Ranger roll down the road. I got out of the cruiser and ran towards it. I got in and hit the brakes just as the Ranger was backing off the road. I crashed into a tree which had fallen over, broken in half. I drove onto the road, and she met me there. "Thanks for the help," I said. "I never did get your name." Well, after some hesitation, she said, "My name's Melissa Ryder." "What on earth made you drive towards that light?" I asked. "I saw someone out there," she answered. "Didn't know it was you again. What's your name, by the way?" "Darryl," I replied. We stood there on the road in silence. Only the lights from the Ranger and the cruiser were on. I sat on my seat with the door open. I was so tired from all of this excitement. "Look," Melissa whispered. "I don't know what's going on here. I just started a month ago, and since being here I've experienced some messed up shit, but this is too much." "What'd you do before this?" I asked. Well, I felt sorry for her. Neither of us understood what was going on here. "I worked up north in Yosemite," she replied. I was offered a spot here, so I took it thinking it'd be nicer than to be frozen half the year. A call from her radio suddenly came through, and it startled her. "Deputy Ryder, are you there?" it spoke. Melissa got in the cruiser and grabbed the mic. "This is Ryder," she responded. "We need you to come to the station," the voice said. "Copy that. On my way." Melissa got out and turned to me. "I have to go, and so do you. I won't say I saw you, but I think you should go. They'll be coming down here looking for something." She got back into her cruiser. "Follow me," she said, and closed the door. Well, for a moment I thought about turning in the other direction. Instead, I followed. No sense in getting into more hot water. It was 15 minutes before she suddenly stopped, and I had to slam on my brakes to keep from hitting her. I got out and walked toward the door. I looked into the window, but she didn't seem to notice me. She just stared forward. I knocked on the window, but nothing. I looked at her hands. They were clenching the steering wheel. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, so I banged on the window again, louder. "Melissa," I shouted. "Open the door. What's going on?" I ran towards the front of the cruiser. There was a look of utter fright on her face. I turned around, but saw nothing. Then she must have slammed her foot onto the gas because the engine let out a loud roar. The cruiser accelerated so fast there was barely any time to run out of the way, so I tried to leap out of the way but got slammed onto the windshield. I rolled off the side of the cruiser, breaking off the side mirror as I fell. But Melissa just kept going, faster and faster. The red taillights got smaller and smaller as she drove, till eventually she disappeared. I picked myself up and limped back to the Ranger. I got about 3 miles when I saw Melissa's cruiser off to the side. I got out to see the cruiser had driven into a decline and into a large boulder. I stepped down to where it had crashed. I looked to see Melissa in the driver's seat. Her airbag had gone off and her seatbelt was on. I called to her. "Melissa, you okay?" But no answer. I opened the driver door and reached to unbuckle her, and she quietly moaned. I did my best to pull her out when I noticed my right forearm had been badly cut. Must have been either from the windshield, the mirror, or hitting the ground. A voice came from the radio. "Deputy Ryder, are you on your way?" I reached past her and grabbed the microphone. Officer down," I said. Officer down. Deputy Ryder has been in an accident." There was no answer. "Hello?" I tried again. "There was an accident. She drove off the road and hit a rock. She needs an ambulance." Still nothing. "Deputy Ryder," the radio started. "Come in, Deputy Ryder. Where are you?" I tried again. "Hey, officer down. Needs an ambulance." And again, nothing. Followed by someone on the other side asking for Ryder again. I kept trying to talk to dispatch, but nothing. And I started smelling something in the air. I looked around, and from the front of the cruiser, smoke started floating up. I wrapped my arms around Melissa and pulled her out as the fire started to crackle from under the hood. I started dragging her away from the cruiser and towards my Ranger. Well, the cruiser caught fire quickly, and my shoulder gave out as I lifted Melissa off the road and into the Ranger. I put my good arm under her shoulder and dragged her as best I could. As I opened the passenger door to let her in, she seemed to wake up. Her eyes were blinking rapidly, and her breathing intensified, but she still wasn't fully there yet. It took a lot of time and effort, but I managed to put her in the back seat lying down. By the time I got her into the driver's seat, the cruiser had been fully engulfed in flames. "Don't worry," I yelled to Melissa. "As soon as we get you out of here to the station, they can get you help." "Oh, they'll get you," she replied very weakly. "I was sent to arrest you if I saw you. They'll think you did this to me." "Well, that doesn't matter now," I said. "We need to get you to a hospital. That's what matters." I pushed the gas back as far as it would go and hauled ass on the dirt road, in hopes of finding a bigger road. From the rearview mirror I could see the cruiser burning. It was the only thing that was lit for miles. The further I drove away, the less I could tell it was a fire. It was more of an unfocused glow. Driving through the night at this speed made me nervous, but I needed to get Melissa to a doctor. At one point I noticed a crossed road and tried to turn, only I was going so fast that I lost control of the Ranger and nearly flipped it over. I might as well have been driving on Thunder Road. I tried to regain control, but found myself swerving off the road. I was lucky not to hit anything, as well as the Ranger not driving into something that I couldn't get out of. I slowly got back onto the road, and stopped to turn and check on Melissa. Well, thankfully I'd strapped her as best I could with the seatbelts, so she didn't get hurt any worse than she already was. I turned my attention to the road in front of me, pushed forward, minding both Melissa and the road. Tried to focus and look at the distance. The wind was picking up and the dust was getting thick. It didn't take long for dust to completely cover the windshield again. I had to stop and let the winds pass. However, it only seemed to get worse. The winds were becoming faster, and I could feel the Ranger starting to sway from side to side. I had no choice but to put it in park. The rocking was getting worse. I looked over to Melissa, who hadn't moved for a while. I reached over and nudged her a little, and she let out a soft moan. Her face was bruised, and a little bit of blood came out of her mouth. Poor girl, I couldn't comprehend what had come over her, and I didn't think she would know either. I turned to look through the windshield, but nothing. I pushed onward slowly. The dust didn't just cover the windshield, it seemed fixed in place. All of a sudden, I felt the Ranger move backwards. I floored it, but as loud as the engine roared, it didn't move. I'm trying so hard to get away from whatever the hell had us. I felt something. It felt like we were being elevated, like we were floating. The Ranger began to shake, and as I tried to look beyond the dust, what I could see seemed to move downward. We were being lifted. By what? I don't know. Then the Ranger came crashing down. The dust fell suddenly as well, and what I saw before me was ungodly. There was someone or something in front at some distance. Maybe a man. He was certainly huge. Even from that distance I could tell his size. There was a bluish light above him. Well, from what I could see, he wasn't wearing normal clothes. I thought maybe some sort of suit. He began to walk towards me. I was stuck there, drawn to him. I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I just couldn't shake it. I couldn't look away. I felt the air get heavier. I began having trouble breathing. As he got closer, I could see him more clearly now. It looked like he was wearing some sort of spacesuit. He walked very slowly, very mechanical. The light stayed in place and turned at an angle, giving the man a silhouette. Suddenly Melissa began to stir. That was enough to break my concentration on what was in front of me. I immediately put the Ranger in reverse and turned it around, and began to speed away. I didn't get far. I floored it, but the Ranger got stuck. I looked into the rearview mirror. The man was still walking towards us. The air became heavier, and it was getting harder to breathe. "What happened?" Melissa asked. I didn't answer. I just kept trying to get the Ranger to move, but it was no use. That man kept coming, and eventually I stopped trying. The man's reflection in the left mirror to one side, I looked into my right mirror and saw him standing next to the Ranger. "What?" Melissa shrieked. I didn't look at her. Then, all of a sudden, she screamed. She must have seen the man next to us. And she kept on screaming. She tried to unbuckle herself, but wasn't able to. "I'm stuck," she cried. "I'm stuck. Help me." I turned to her. The man was still outside the door. The light was still fixed in place, but I had a clearer image of him now. The suit didn't seem like one an astronaut would wear. It looked like it was made of metal, like one that those deep-sea divers would wear back in the day. And the helmet was huge. It had various eye holes in it, and it had a ring around it which connected the helmet to the suit. Melissa froze with fear. The air was heavy, and I couldn't move at all. He put his hand on the window, A giant metal glove covered it entirely, and there were grooves on the palms, maybe so he could grip. He pulled down the window with ease. Oh, Melissa reached for her hip. I thought at first it was to again attempt to unbuckle, but she drew her gun instead. She pointed it at the man, her hand shaking wildly. Her breathing was rapid and deep. Or she must have felt the weight of the air on her too. The man leaned in and reached for her. Melissa fired twice, and the man retreated instantly. A loud hiss came out, and white gas spewed from where she must have shot him. I unbuckled and reached in the back seat for my rifle. I aimed for one of his eye holes, but I didn't fire. I couldn't. "Shoot him," Melissa cried, but I didn't. "Shoot him," she repeated, but I still just sat there. He came closer. Melissa pointed her gun again, but he was able to grab it out of her hands. His arms were very long. He looked at it. His fingers were too big to get to the trigger. He pointed the barrel to the hole in his suit. He then turned to us and dropped the gun. I lowered my rifle and looked at him, at his head. Maybe I was staring into his eyes. Melissa turned to me. She grabbed for my rifle, but I wouldn't let it go. "Shoot him," she cried. "What the hell's wrong with you? He'll kill us, like he did the campsite, remember?" She was right. The campers, maybe he took them, or whatever happened, he had to have done something to them. I leveled the rifle and aimed it at his head. He came to the truck and tried to rip the door off. I shot him directly in the head, right through an eye hole. He fell back. I turned forward and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. "He's getting up," Melissa shouted. "You gotta go faster." Then, without thinking, I made a right turn. Well, I was lucky I didn't veer off the road. I could see to my right the man was upright, and he was huge. The light still on him, he seemed to look back at us. Looking at the road, all I could see was where the headlights were shining. All I could see was the dirt road. I kept at it until the ranger started to rumble, and it then came to a halt. I turned the key, but nothing. I kept at it for a while. Melissa was able to unhook the seatbelts and sat upright. Well, she looked frightened. Her face was pale, and her breathing had sped up. Suddenly, the headlights turned on. I looked at the front of the truck. There was a phone booth right in front of us. There was light coming from a lamppost high above. It was covered in graffiti. The tether that would be attached to a phone book was swaying with the wind. The phone began to ring. We just sat there, letting it ring on forever. Well, it sure felt like it. It had gone on long enough that I felt compelled to go and answer. I opened my door and began to slide out when Melissa grabbed my arm. "What are you doing?" she cried. "What the hell are you doing? You don't know what's going on. It could be that thing trying to bait you." Well, I heard what she said, but it didn't register right away. I got out and walked to the booth. I stopped just in front of it, and then I looked behind me. Melissa was getting out of the Ranger, carrying the rifle while looking all around. I stepped into the booth, and I stared at the phone while it rang. I turned to see if I could spot the man anywhere. He wasn't around, but it felt like he was near, like he was watching. Finally, after a good long minute, I picked up the phone. I held it in my hands. After a long time of ringing, the dead silence was unsettling. Not even the wind was making a sound. I turned to see Melissa walking slowly towards me. She was still reeling from the crash. "It might be him," Melissa said. "See what he wants." She turned to face the direction we'd come from, with the rifle firmly in her hands, ready, I hoped, for whatever might come. I put the phone to my ear. At first there was only silence. I was just about to hang up when a low humming sound came through. Then a voice, which spoke slowly. "You know me, don't you?" said the voice. "I am the one the one you look to. I didn't know what to make of what he'd said. Do not be afraid. I am here for you. I looked behind me. I looked past the ranger only to see the light from above. It was beaming down, but I couldn't see anything under it. I looked all around, but only saw darkness. I put the phone back to my ear. I could only hear the humming now. Melissa came closer to me. She took the phone and placed it to her ear. "Well, I can't hear anything," she replied. I took the phone from her and put it to my ear. I also heard nothing. "You hear anything?" she asked. And I shook my head. I was about to put the phone back when we began to hear footsteps. They were heavy, sounding like metal banging against the ground. Melissa raised the rifle and backed towards me into the phone booth. The footsteps got louder, but I couldn't see the man anywhere. But I could hear a faint hiss in the air that was coming out of the hole in his suit. "Come on," I said. "Back to the truck." And I put her shoulder over my head and helped her walk back to the ranger. As I put her in the passenger seat, something grabbed me by my shoulder and turned me around with so much force I almost fell over. It was the man. He seemed to be breathing heavily, and the hole in his suit was no longer spewing out air, and the glow from the eye holes was dimming. He reached out to me. He grabbed me by the shirt and threw me onto the ranger's hood. I rolled off the hood when I heard Melissa scream. I got up to my feet as quickly as I could and saw the man grabbing her by the leg and trying to pull her out of the ranger. She held onto the seat, kicking at him with her free leg. I ran to the driver's side door, opened it, and tried to pull her to me, but the man's strength was far beyond mine. I glanced over for the rifle and reached for it. When I grabbed it and readied it, the man immediately let go. I aimed at him, and he stood there. "Back," I shouted. "Get away from her." But he only stood there. Melissa crawled towards me out of the ranger. I helped her get to her feet, while still aiming the rifle at the man. He began to walk around the front of the ranger, and we backed away from him. And the further we backed, the more we began to trip over each other's feet. I fired a warning shot, and the man stopped. We all stood still for a while. The air was cold and heavy, the silence was solid, and the lights in the man's eye holes had gone out completely. The man then disappeared into the dark. "Run," I shouted. As best we could, we ran back to the ranger. We got in and locked the doors. "Right, there's a revolver in the glove compartment," I told Melissa. She opened it and found it, and checked to see how many rounds we had. "It's empty," she told me. And she ran her hand through the glove compartment and found a box of ammo. She loaded the gun and aimed it to get a feel for it. I turned the ranger around and put it in gear, and then we saw the bright light in front of us. The light this time began to move towards us. I turned to see the man standing behind us, and his eye-hole lights were back on. Melissa turned around to see the man. "Oh, fuck," she cried. After a moment, with the revolver firmly in her hand, she turned around and aimed at the man. "Keep the truck still," she said to me, and fired 2 rounds. Well, she hit him in the chest, and he finally fell over. My God, what have we done? So that was a bit of a weird one for your Monday evening's entertainment. What did you think of that one? Yeah, something about it that just really piqued my interest, and yeah, I wanted to read that one for you all, so I hope you enjoyed it. Now, back to what I did last night. I've been working on a lot of ideas for my own writing, and yeah, I've got this kind of idea for a series of stories set in North Korea, and I debuted one of them last night. So, some feedback. A lot of you were like, oh, you know, it should have been a bit more creepy. It should have been focusing on the nasty things that happened there. It's like, well, I didn't want to cram it all into the first episode. And it was just a bit of like, well, testing the waters, to be honest. So, Thanks for your feedback. I'm pretty happy with how the first episode turned out. It will be getting a lot more darker as it goes on if I decide to continue, which I think I will. So there's going to be lots of touring around the country, some of the famous landmarks, and some of the not so pleasant things that apparently go on there. So don't worry about that. You know, if you thought it was a bit too mild, it won't be going forward. Anyway, that's enough for one evening. Thanks again for joining me. Back again on Wednesday. Not sure what with yet, but if you have any ideas of something you want me to read, feel free to let me know in the comment section below the video, and I'll do my best to make you all happy like I always do. Until then, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye.